So I want you to imagine that you are in a desert and you've been in this desert for days and you are thirsty AF, right? Like you're so thirsty. And you're at this point sort of like crawling through this desert, and then you see off in the distance a sort of shimmering mirage that appears to be an oasis. And so like you like scrabble your way there with the last of your energy. Oh, hurrah, it turns out to in fact be an oasis. You dunk your head into the water, you come out, and the first syllable out of your mouth is, hmm. That's the first syllable of my first name. And so that name is pronounced Ma D No B.
Madinobi.
Beautiful. Correct. There you go.
Madinobi.
Welcome to another edition of Cults and the Culting of America podcast. My name is Scot Loyd, along with the knitting cult lady, Daniella Mestyanek Young. Daniella, how are you doing tonight?
You know, I'm recovering from the shock and awe campaign. And yesterday I was feeling pretty down, but then I slept for 12 hours and I woke up like more ready to like plan and prepare and fight and have the important conversations and do the things. And I'm really excited to talk to Chloe. We were connected by somebody really cool. And I didn't like people like Chloe fascinate me as far as like 10 years old, made a decision, chose to be something, and then like went and did it. Of course, coming from a cult, you know, I don't even know that you have like these options of careers. Anyways, Chloe, we would love to hear about you.
Welcome, Chloe.
Hey, thank you so much. Hi. Delighted to be here, honored. And yeah, about me. Well, my peers call me the brand scientist. And that's because I use all manner of sciencey things like behavioral and network science to make sure that the folks that I work with have their ideas get the attention and recognition they deserve in the rooms that have the most impact and influence on our society. That's like in a nutshell what I do. Um, yeah, and the key, the key, I would say, maybe angle that I'm coming at things from is from this angle of unrecognition, which is a phenomenon that I sort of like noted and then named and coined and like have been speaking about ever since. And so ultimately, the idea is that the folks that I work with are dealing with under recognition, and I used my stuff to fix that.
Chloe, I was watching some of your material and content today, and I was really impressed, first of all, with just how smart you are. I mean, the fact that wow, I am I'm struggling to keep up here, but some things that you said really impressed me in the context of what we talk about on this program that Daniella has rightfully pointed out over and over again that in the United States we deal with cults, obviously individual cults, but then there is like this meta cult of I believe I heard somebody refer to it as a mythical norm, right? That
Okay. Wow.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. Well,
So
who's gonna
we'll
come back
keep
to me?
talking.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the conflict mediation stuff in your past? Just
Sure.
because I think this all ties together in super interesting ways, the things that you do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, I am a conflict mediator by training. I went to school for international conflict resolution and mediation, and so I was trained to facilitate peace negotiations in the context of civil war and, you know, international conflict as well. And I learned all of this, like the bulk, would I say the bulk of my training? I'll say my master's, right? My, you know, grad degree. I got in Israel of all places, and that was an intentional choice. Like I went to
Wow.
Israel because I was like, I want to study this intractable conflict, and I have already begun to study it from the Arab side. let me go to Israel and see what's happening on the ground here. Um, so that I don't just have like the wider Arab perspective, as in like, what does Egypt feel? What does Jordan feel? Right. But I also have like, what about the Arab Israelis? Right. What about the Palestinians? What about the Gazans? And then of course, like, what about the Israelis? I wanted to understand conflict. And so it is one of the longest running conflicts. And so that's why I went to Israel to study it. Of course, now that I have now that I matured as a practitioner, I know that there are other longer standing conflicts. But at the time I was like, oh yeah, this is like one of the big ones. Let me go here and study it. So yeah.
Yeah. And then, so then you make this, I, I'm sure it's not a leap. I'm sure there was a whole path that made sense, right?
Yeah,
From
yeah.
conflict mediator, and you're doing these things in other countries, and now you're working on under recognition. Such a great
Yeah.
term.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yeah, I mean, and I could understand how anyone who sort of looks at where I am and what I was doing, I can see why folks would be like, hmm, feels like a jump. So, and here's why it's not. Here's why that progression was actually a lot more subtle than it seems from the outside. Um, I was working on this is something that dawned on me slowly over time, but I think that it happened the most intensely when I was working on the civil war in Yemen. I was a very junior member of a team that had been brought on by a pretty sizable ethnic minority in Yemen. And they brought us on because they weren't a part of the UN peace talks and they wanted to be, right? Now, my speciality within the whole conflict resolution and mediation space was very specifically using what we know about the human mind and what we know about like human social dynamics and the ways in which those things interface to make peace settlements more likely to happen and more likely to last. And so from that perspective, I knew that this ethnic minority really should have been at the table if whatever peace settlement that was going to happen was going to be sustainable or was going to last past 5 or 10 years. And so that led me to this uh, reckoning sounds dramatic, but like it kind of was, where I'm like, okay, as a mediator, I do have some control over the dynamics within a room, but I don't necessarily have any control over who gets into the room. Um, and as evidenced by this situation, that's a problem, right? Because these folks who really should have been at the table weren't even getting in the door. And so that is what really began my sort of research spiral, maybe we'll say, into trying to understand what had happened here. Like, how did we even get to this um, set of events, right? And and that's despite the fact that all the things that we up until now have been saying need to be true in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening, right? So like everyone's like very highly educated, everyone has like the best intentions, people are looking to pay attention to their biases and that sort of thing. And you know, like all of those things that we say, hey, like this stuff has to be true in order to prevent something like this from happening. Those things were true and it was still happening, right? And so that's really what like made me go like, okay, like there's something going on here. There's something up here. And I did come upon this phenomenon of under recognition, right? And the reason that I then ended up where I am right now and being called a brand scientist is because I realized that the answer to this was actually brands, right? That every single nation state that I had either interfaced with or had bilaterals with, or like whatever context, right? Every single nation state has a brand, right? That's why you don't make certain moves with like Germany or France, because their brands inform you how they will respond. Brands teach others how to treat you. And so what I realized is that, okay, if we can shape these brands appropriately for folks like these this ethnic minority that wasn't at the table. If we can do that, then we can not only get them access into these rooms, but we can make sure that they have influence when they do so. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am and why I do what I do.
Um, by the way, like, kind of amazing what has been going on right now and what I've been talking about is like people keep making these connections right now, of course, with Donald Trump and what went on in Germany. Right.
Yeah,
And I'm like, but
yeah.
what we keep leaving out is America's brand. Right. And
Correct.
like
Correct.
in Germany, I studied not as cool as studying abroad in Israel, but I did a semester in Germany. And like
Mm.
the Germans themselves will make a joke that the reason Germany has never had a popular revolution is because the peasants couldn't afford the train fare. And so I keep reminding people, you know, like in America, we'll rip up your train lines, right?
Right.
Like
Right. Right.
very different attitudes.
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, it's so, you know, like the brand and the story that you're telling. I think it
Yeah.
is, you know, it's this month exactly. I'm writing about cult language and the way that cult
Mm.
leaders use language to sell their story,
Yes.
right? Because
Yes.
a cult is a group formed around a lie,
Right.
oftentimes with bad stereotypes, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you have to have an enemy, you have to paint someone. But like language is such a thing we're willing to change about ourselves. And
Yeah.
then we like slowly don't notice things. But then I also think of what you do and like this larger like plan to keep some people out
Yeah.
of the spotlight and underrepresented.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, there's so much I could say here. My goodness. So, where do I even want to start? Okay, so I feel like I want to start with some definitions that might be useful maybe for our
Yeah.
listeners and also for the conversation. So, first thing that I will say is that a brand, right? I know that there are as many definitions of what a brand is as there are people to give them. I'm sure people listening to this are probably sick of hearing what what a brand actually is, air quotes. So I'm not going to do that necessarily. I will say that from a scientific perspective, this is what a brand likely is, right? And it is a system of ideas that influences the behavior of other people. Said
Hmm.
another way, it's a kind of influential real estate in someone's head, right? And so everything that you're saying, right, like completely tracks, especially now when you're talking about language, which I would consider not the brand itself, right, but a brand asset, right? So think about it like branding, right? A brand's branding is really just a brand's memorable assets. It's the thing that the brand can use as memory anchors, like hooks in the different parts of your memory network to make sure that this system of ideas is connected to all of the chains of behavior that they would like to be connected to, right? So that they can influence those chains of behavior. And language is absolutely one of the most um, rich avenues for developing that, right? So, yeah,
Yeah.
there's so much.
It's you know, I've just been through the master's degree crash course on how branding works when I
Uh-huh.
was trying to brand myself as group behavior gal and this is what I do and I built up this huge platform and then I got kicked off. And so then
Oh,
I came back and I called myself knitting cult lady and like that was it. It
yeah.
took off, you know. Then, of course, I started referring to my spouse as Mr. Knitting Cult Lady, and then my child as Knitting Cult Baby, and then we have Knitted Cult Puppy
It's
and
perfect.
Knitting Cult Chats, and now I've done like a knitting cult book, like a knitting patterns book that also
Oh my
educates
gosh.
people about components of cults.
Incredible.
But anyway, and that's too funny. And then ever since the election though, I've just been like, Captain, calm down. So now
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
like bringing in the military side of me to just like walk people through, some of the reality stuff. But even what you're talking about in language, right? And I was like,
Mhm.
I literally sit here every morning and I just casually and calmly talk to people about what's going on and what's the threat and what's the reality,
Yeah.
because like all of that is so important, and just
Yeah.
like giving context to it, but also still being able to like, I don't know, think about what we're going to do next.
Like what we're gonna do, and also like doing that whilst also like self-regulating, right? Because having us dysregulated is also a huge part of the strategy, right? So I just, I mean, so one of the things that has been interesting in the course of recent events is that a lot of my work has started being framed as like the science of resistance. Do you know what I mean? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Where because at the end of the day, like what I'm talking about is influence, right? It's making sure that
Mm-hmm.
you have an influential idea and that you are able to get that influential idea into influential spaces and places, right? And that once it is there, it does its job, right? That like exposure to that idea means commitment to that idea, right? Like that's really what all of this work is about, right? And so it's just really interesting to see how the last couple of months have shifted that from um like I guess like change the world with your world changing idea to no, you're part of the resistance now, and a
Yeah.
successful resistance looks like this, right?
Mm.
So just very interesting
Yep.
to see that change. And so like I'm also noting just from what you told me about where your work has been going, that there's been that shift as well. So that's curious to me. That's really interesting.
There really has. And I've been just talking about how like, you know what? I thought I was gonna run away and go live in another country, and then like I was like, do I have to stay and train the resistance? Is
Right.
this our like is this gonna be our job now?
Yeah.
Um
And it kind of looks like yes. And that's honestly what I get for calling myself professional rebel scum, like literally calling myself that. It's just what I get. Like I did that to myself.
I feel the same way because I kept saying, y'all, I study bad groups and bad leaders, right? I'm still just your friendly neighborhood intelligence officer. And now, like, my morning cult briefs, I just call them America threat briefs, like, we're just
Ooh,
like,
yeah.
I'm just doing this now. Um,
Ah,
but, language is important, but also representation. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir, but something that just happened this week. We're not going to have this woke army, so we're putting a freeze on DEI, right? And so
yeah.
the Air Force took down mention of the Tuskegee Airmen and
Yep.
women pilots in World War II.
Yep.
And there was such an outcry
Yep.
from the American people that they
Yep.
put it back 2 days later, right? Like it was
Yep.
down for the weekend.
Yeah.
And actually, because I had been talking about malicious compliance and like service
Hmm.
members standing up, and someone asked me, like, do you think that was malicious compliance? And like, maybe,
Maybe.
maybe someone was like, but like, once you get that representation in the door, once like those things are set into history and put there and talked about, like it doesn't just erase that easily, And I think
Yeah, that's
like
exactly right.
like
Sorry, go ahead.
it's just like I think there's part of like everyone acting like, oh, he's just gonna end America, right? Like,
Yeah.
boom, it's over. And it's like, I'm like, no, he's gonna do a lot of things and he's gonna
Mhm.
punch a lot of holes. But like, this has also been a thing that's built up a lot, right? And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
there's all these people too, as you said, to resist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And so like so that's also something that that encourages me, right? That like what's happening now, right, is that folks in that particular camp, right, are trying to chip away at what are already social norms, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that already sort of puts them on the back foot, right? Because they're trying to take something away that is already there, right? Um, it's harder to put something in place than it is to maintain that thing, right? So we, in a lot of ways, despite how bleak things seem, we do have the advantage. However, however, right, I cannot stress enough that they are aware that what they are trying to chip away at are social norms. And so they've been going at it in the way that you attack social norms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what that means is that what's left to us is to maintain the social norms that keep us safe, but also to take some of the resistance, as it were, underground, right? Like, and this is some of this is coming from like the network science of it all, right? But network science has shown us that there is less resistance to change on the fringes. In fact, that's part of what happened with like the advent of Trump and his ilk, right? They started on the fringes where there was less resistance to the adoption of this particular idea, and then they reached a tipping point and then cascaded, right? And so a lot of what we are going to have to end up doing ourselves is, again, yes, maintaining the social norms that keep us safe, right? But also doing a bit of that engineering ourselves, right? And that absolutely means starting in the places where there is less resistance to change and building up that critical mass. And then once we've hit that critical mass, making sure that we continue to defend that critical mass, right? Because I think that's something that is really easy to do. And in a lot of ways, it looks like we might have done, and that we sort of got comfortable with how things were. And we're like, yeah, like stuff isn't really going to change. And I think that's why Trump was so surprising when he came about the first time, because we were all sort of like, well, he's just ridiculous. Yes, and right? So there's sort of like a two-part um strategy here. And knowing that, I think it's important for folks to decide where it is they feel like their role is, right? Because you don't
Yeah.
necessarily need to be doing both. Um, and in fact, it may not be wise to do both, right? So, like, figure out what your role is in the larger ecosystem, and then, get to work.
Yeah. I mean, so for listeners, they know I have my second podcast, which is Hey White Woman, and it's me and a Black creator called White Woman Whisperer, and we just sit and deconstruct the cult of white supremacy.
Mm.
And so we're talking about now about how like we probably have to build an army of anti-racist Amy's that can just like
Mhm.
go out and like use our powerful voices and our control of trillions of dollars to like
Mhm.
protect other people that
Right.
are going to be targeted. So I just wanted to bring this up to talk about too, because I think like a lot of that is really important. And, one of the things I've been going through with Pete Hegseth being confirmed as the Secretary of Defense, right? This is like the worst vet bro that we
Oh,
all hated. We women knew we weren't safe around,
yeah.
but like the bros knew he would lie to get you out of war crimes, right? Like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
he has white supremacist tattoos. He doesn't
Mhm.
think women should be in combat. I was one of the women on the first ground combat teams, right? Like very proud of it, wrote a
Yeah.
book. But when I stop and think about they've been weaponizing, oh, America doesn't want to see dead ladies. America doesn't want to see dead mothers. And of course,
Mhm.
they mean white.
Correct.
right?
Correct.
Well, like, we can use that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
America doesn't want to see dead white lady mothers,
Yeah.
right? So,
Exactly.
like, I keep hearing people talk about martial law, right? And I'm like, first of
Mhm.
all, the American army knows quite well, it is quite fresh, the knowledge that we could
Yeah.
not occupy a place like America. But second of all, they declare martial law, and I'm talking to white women right now. Get out of your houses, flood the streets.
Yeah.
They're not sending 25-year-old captains, or not sending 20-year-old kids that are all the same colors and races and genres as the rest of us
Mhm.
down your streets
Yeah.
to shoot you.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, these are the things we're joking on the other podcast that our military maneuvers, and we call just the tip. We're going to put all the white ladies right at the front and just
gosh.
like march.
Incredible. And also, right? Like, true.
Yes.
Right? Like,
This is what I keep saying, right? And like, I live in Maryland, and we try to practice this. When like you see cops interacting with Black people, you pull over and you
Mhm.
observe.
Mhm.
And it's like, they're not gonna mow me down. And
Right.
then the revolutionary part of me is like, and if they did, how fast would that be on the news, right?
Right,
Like,
exactly.
how
Just
fast
make
would
sure it's
that
on camera.
revolt come?
Yeah.
So like, specifically white women, think about how we are protecting our Black and brown neighbors and the people that like we know that they're going to be coming for, and like understanding that 48% of us didn't vote for that guy, and we can use the whiteness as a shield, and we can use it as a weapon against them.
Correct. Correct. Correct.
Hmm.
Oh my gosh.
And it's also crazy to me that we're having like discussions about revolution in 2025 America.
I know. I know. I know. And also, like, is it? I don't know.
Yeah. And also, maybe did this need to happen?
Right. Like, I'm wondering, sometimes I wonder. Genuinely, I do not wish the fresh hell that all of this madness is visiting upon people. Like, I don't wish it on anyone. Um and at the same time, I mean, this is the country we live in, right? Like, this is the country as it is. We just, some of us just didn't realize, you know?
This is what every
So,
single Black woman I have talked to since the election has said.
yeah.
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 And I also think part of the answer right now, speaking of underrepresentation of people saying, what do we do? Is like,
Mhm.
go listen to Black women. Go
Yes.
listen to the people who have been doing this, who
Mm.
have master's degrees in crisis management, but also like communities that have been doing this forever, because have always known that this is the America that we live in.
Correct. Correct.
And I'm continually learning every day with my explanations to also, like, it really is influencing tons of people. Something else I think of is just like the trauma in communities after this. And like, when you're in crisis mode, you just keep pushing and keep planning and keep going. But so often we don't like heal and acknowledge the trauma. And I'm just like,
I'm like, I think this is also a huge part of, and like maybe I'm like heading off the reservation now in terms of like topic and what we want to talk about, but I think this is also a big part of why a lot of Black women are sort of just like, I'm gonna rest now. Like, you all do you. The 98% or 92% or whatever it was, like, we're gonna brunch, and that's good day, right? Because I think that there is a lot of healing
Yeah.
and like reckoning with that trauma that needs to happen um with
Yeah.
ourselves.
And not that
And
it's
that
my place to approve it or not, but yeah, to just like amplify that. I'm like, I totally get it. I totally 100% get why Black women are like, no, we're done. Like, we really tried. We got her this close. Like,
truth be carried.
white women, we have failed. We have failed over and over and over again. And now I honestly think part of it is like, yeah, white women need to suffer. And we will, right? Like the promise of the cult is always a lie. You know, things
Correct.
are getting worse, not better. This
Yeah.
eventually affects everyone, you know.
And this actually reminds me of the point, poor Scott, I don't know what happened to him, but like this reminds me of the point that Scott was getting at, which is this idea of the mythical norm, right? So for those who are unfamiliar with what that is, that's a term that comes from Audre Lorde. And the mythical norm is essentially who society was designed to work for, right? And mythical norm is a he who is white, straight, able-bodied, wealthy, educated, thin, relatively young. Um, Goodness, what else? Cisgendered. Um, did I mention straight? Right? Like all of those things,
Yeah.
right?
The
All of those
all
things.
the bros that are super angry right now.
Correct. And and any deviation from that mythical norm introduces friction into your life. Every deviation from that mythical norm increases the opportunities for under recognition to take place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's because the status quo has been set up to cater to this mythical norm, right? So any behaviors that do not align with the status quo, we as human beings have been wired to defend against them, right? Like we've been wired to defend the status quo, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That's no matter how unjust or how not great for us that status quo happens to be. So that's why behavior change in general is uncomfortable. Um, it's also why it's really difficult for behavior change along these lines to take place. Like that's
Mm-hmm.
why it's difficult. So
And
yeah,
this is
sorry, go
also
ahead.
like such cult theory. Like this is how cults work.
Yeah.
You know, so like in the Children of God, when our leader died and his cray cray lady took over,
Mm,
she put out this crazy doctrine, which was basically adults having sex with Jesus in their minds while they're having sex with each other.
oh,
Crazy, right?
yeah.
And it was a whole series, and they were given very specific instructions that I find
Mm,
fascinating, which was that nobody was to read it alone. Like it was intended to be read
um,
in a group, but
mhm,
if you were like, you know, the one on childcare or the one whatever, like you weren't to just catch up with it on your own.
right.
Right. And this is because social proof, which I'm sure you are wildly familiar with.
Yes, correct.
Right.
Yes.
But like, as everyone is thinking this is crazy, but they're
Yeah.
looking around and nobody else is saying anything. So they're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. I'm the only one that thinks this is crazy. You
Yeah.
know, and I say sometimes with the whole emperor has no clothes thing, right? They're like, we like to think that when the child says it, we all see, but I think what happens is we take the child out back and beat them for saying it and then
Correct.
continue
Like,
on.
and this also brings up the idea of adoption thresholds, which is something that is really it's like a very basic concept that's really core to network science. And it's essentially just the idea that like every single person in a network of people has an adoption threshold, right? So it's the number of people that they need to see in their sort of close-knit community um, who has adopted a behavior before they too will then adopt said behavior, right? So like that's also absolutely what was happening in that scenario, right? That like by themselves that person's adoption threshold probably would not have been met because this idea was so off the reservation, right? But when you are together in a group and there's no like overwhelming dissent or anything that's coming through, it looks like everyone around you is adopting it. And so that overcomes your adoption threshold, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's
Mm-hmm.
another thing that's absolutely
Well,
taking
and
place.
this is why it's so relevant that, like, the outgoing president of the United States was reminding soldiers of their oaths, right? It was like reminding them that, like, in the American military, like, we are all individually supposed to assess, you know, whether orders are illegal or immoral
Correct.
without following them. And that adoption threshold thing, I mean, so much in the military, right? Like, you do the craziest things, and we literally will say to each other, like, oh, you just got to drink the Kool-Aid, you know, just to like justify doing silly things that we know are silly, but we're doing them anyways.
Yeah. Which is like, I mean, genuinely terrifying, but like also, this is also what, and now we're gonna get into my one of the things that I'm known on the internet to talk about, but also is kind of like maybe a niche, like brand marketing, like those people world thing. So like it may not be interesting to folks, but like maybe it is. We'll see. We'll see. And it's this, right? That there is this thing that people do when they are trying to target a message to a specific person. Um, they create what is called an ideal client avatar or something of that nature, right? And that's because an ideal client avatar makes it really, really easy to talk to many different people as if you're talking to one person, right? That's why they do it. Now, the issue with an ideal client avatar is the fact that all that it's doing really is segmenting the world or your market or whatever it happens to be demographically and psychographically if we're
Mm-hmm.
being really cutting edge, right? For the uninitiated, demographics are like census level data. So like your age, your gender, um, your race, stuff like that. Psychographic information are things like your hobbies, your preferences, right? Things like that. Do you prefer Hulu to Netflix, right? That's a psychographic. Now, where this becomes problematic is when you start looking at the effect that that has on groups of people, right? Because when you segment people so that they are both demographically and psychographically homogenous, what that creates is the dangerous kind of echo chamber that has led to a lot of the violence that we see now exploding across our television screens, right?
Yeah.
And that's because those networks of people lack the countervailing forces to prevent the spread of disinformation and misinformation, the kind of stuff that can
Mm-hmm.
intentionally be deployed in the case of disinformation to manipulate people's perspectives and influence them into dangerous, risky behaviors that they might not otherwise participate in. And the kind of countervailing forces that prevent something like that are, get this, diversity, right? Diversity of experience, diversity of like demographic diversity and psychographic diversity
All of
specifically,
it.
like,
Yeah.
right? Like if we're going to put
That's
two-sided
why
point on it.
this is why I almost think it's like almost humorous, the whole trying to walk back diversity initiatives in the military. Cause like we know it's made it better, as it
Yeah.
always does.
Yes.
Right? Like it has shown us things we don't know.
Yeah.
But also, you know, so I think like with cults, right? And people are like, "Oh, well, both sides are cults," right? And I'm like, "Okay, yes. In a two-party system, in a black and white system, like by definition, it is culty and these tactics are used and influence and blah blah blah."
Yeah.
But 50 years ago, right? One side made one, what do you call it? Like avatar, right? We only care about cisgender white Christian men.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, going back to language and influence and disinformation, right? It's like they've been speaking with one voice, with one message,
Yeah.
with one simple answer, right?
Yeah.
Which simple answers don't exist. We know on this podcast. Okay.
Exactly.
I always say anyone giving you a simple answer to a complex problem is trying to cult you or con you, you know.
Yes.
And so, and then people are like, okay, well, how do you know both sides are in a cult? And I'm like, okay, here's a simple test you can run. Think about someone on the other side, right? If I had one of my people that I'm thinking about on the other side in my power for 2 weeks, like they were children or their leg was broken or somehow they had to do whatever you said, how many diverse perspectives could I expose them to? And it's about 25, I have counted,
Mhm.
right? And
Yeah.
if they have me, it would be one. It would be one. And
Mhm.
cults rely on isolation. That's
Yes.
part of why, ironically, even though the internet has helped get a lot of people out of cults, like I think was kind
Yeah.
of the end of Children of God and maybe even now the Mormons, but like
Mm.
it's also amplified these echo chambers that we are
Yeah.
in society.
Yeah. That's right. And in really frustrating and terrifying ways. And so that's why that's why the equity and inclusion piece is like so existentially important, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it is that very piece that prevents those echo chambers from becoming the dangerous kind, right? And this isn't to say that like echo chambers by themselves are bad, right? Because there are echo chambers that have like this diversity of thought and opinion and everything. And they're echo chambers because like we share values, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that we share like opinions or like even perspectives, right? Like we share values. So like we believe certain truths to be self-evident, right? Um and this is also why um I always stress that folks focus on the under recognition piece rather than the underrepresentation piece, right? Because underrepresentation is a symptom of underrecognition. And when we
Mm.
try to solve for the underrepresentation piece, so many things happen, right? But like one, we put the impetus on the underrepresented person to solve the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Two, we pretend that there isn't an active agent that is causing that underrepresentation to be the case in the first place, right? And then three, even when we try to solve for the underrepresentation problem, we end up creating a whole bunch of new ones because we're not creating the environment or the context that's necessary to protect that person, right, or those people. And so then we have the tokenization, right? Then we have um folks who are essentially set up to fail, and then like we sort of like wink nudge when they don't manage to beat the odds again. Um, but when we solve for under recognition, we sort of circumnavigate a lot of those things. And we say, like, oh, okay, there's someone who's doing the under recognizing. So they are the source, right? Like they are the folks that we want to focus on. And it also forces us to acknowledge that the changes that need to be put in place in order to make a behavior change sustainable, that those things are going to be uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like on the one hand, if you are forced to represent people, right, you don't have to do that to an uncomfortable degree. And in fact, people often don't. That's why we have the problems that we currently have. If you are forced to recognize someone, right, that you wouldn't otherwise have recognized before, that's a different thing entirely.
Yeah. I like that. It's a great way of thinking about it.
Thank you.
So, have you written a book?
No, but you are literally the second person to ask me that today. And it's on the list. Like
It's a
it's
lot, I know.
yeah, it's on the list and it's coming.
Well, I've figured out the magic sauce of how to sell books on the internet. So,
Mm,
let me know.
That's true. We should talk about that.
How do people work with you? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, um,
I'm sure it's very different.
yeah, no, yes, it's honestly, of course, it definitely depends on who you are, but the most general way that folks work with me is in my visibility engineering program, right? And visibility engineering is just my methodology, right? And the idea is that we first assess where your, I call it your ecosystem of influence is and how it's doing. And I can talk more about what that is if that's interesting to folks. But we assess where your ecosystem of influence is, how it's doing, where it needs support. Then we either build that ecosystem of influence or refine it, and then we run it. And your ecosystem of influence is essentially made out of three parts. It is your platform, right? So that's part number one. Your circle of recognition, which is part number two, and your attention management system, which is part number three. Now, your platform, that's responsible for making sure that you and your work or your idea is the obvious choice for whatever it is you're trying to do, right? You want to be framed as the obvious choice. And when we're working on your platform, that means working on three things in particular. First, it is your premise, right? So your idea is about the world and how it can and should be different. Your positioning, which is all about what makes your premise distinct. And I want to take a moment here and say distinct and not differentiated. Those are two different things. One of them is really good for the brain, and the other one is something that you should probably avoid. Um, and then the third thing is your branding, right? Like your memorable assets, making sure that those things reflect what you need them to, right? So that's your platform. And when you have all of those things essentially up to snuff, what that means is that you are the obvious choice to whoever you need to be the obvious choice to. So that's the first piece of your ecosystem of influence. Questions, thoughts, feelings, concerns.
Nope, you're just giving me so many ideas. I'm like, yep,
Okay.
I'm still working on some of that,
Okay. Um, part two of your ecosystem of influence is your circle of recognition, like I said. And that's responsible for making sure that the opportunities that you need to get your ideas into those influential spaces you need them to be in, make sure that those opportunities are coming to you, right? Now, your circle of recognition is just fancy talk for your network, really, but it's your network structured around the behavior of recognition, right? And so this is something that folks often miss, that your network can be designed to behave in a specific way and to bring about certain outcomes, right? Most people have their network structured to um, amplify the sharing of information, right? Which is great if you're trying to share the news or a cat meme, right? But if you're someone who is in the business of changing hearts and minds and behavior, then you need your network to be structured to amplify your ideas in behavior changing ways. And that's going to look different than the sort of
Mhm.
other orientation. So that's sort of part two, making sure that you have a circle of recognition, that it is structured appropriately, and that you then know how to cultivate it and expand it when necessary. So that's part two. And then finally, we have your attention management system. And this is responsible for making sure that you eventually reach what I call your visibility tipping point. And that's the point at which your ideas catch on at a societal level, right? this is when it clicks at that level and it starts to spread. And the attention management system, what you are doing, right, or what it is it's a system that allows you to gain, maintain, and translate the attention of all of your stakeholders, right? Like, remember, we talked about your circle of recognition, right, and that network. You need to get those folks to move, right? Like, you need to get those folks to change their behavior in some way. And that's what this does. It allows you to maintain, like, get their attention, maintain it, and then translate it into those outcomes that you're looking for. And to do that predictably and do that knowing that the various kinds of stakeholders that you have will mean that that process is going to look different for each of them. So that's the
So,
third thing.
so
Yeah.
by the way, I found out by dyeing a streak of purple into my hair that it grabs the attention of all the bros who cannot stop themselves from commenting on the blue-haired knitting liberal. And then they help my posts go viral and I make money. And it's just like, I'm like, yep, I'm going every color of the rainbow now.
I love that. And that's a perfect example of sort of like motivational programs, actually, which is English chef's kiss. I love that. Which is a huge part of like shaping your attention management system. So those are the three things that are in your ecosystem of influence.
Yeah.
And when I'm working with folks, like I said, we start by assessing where yours currently is. Then we either build it or refine it. And then basically, if you would like, I work with you in an ongoing capacity to support you as you build towards that visibility tipping point, right? So as you are basically leveraging that attention management system. So that's it in
All
a
right.
well, slightly larger
sounds like
nutshell.
me and Lizzie might have to bring you in to do some knitting cult lady stuff.
I'd be delighted.
And also, by the way, I recently conceptualized a musical. I haven't written it all yet, but I'm very excited about it. It's Uncultured, the Cult Baby musical, and it's like Book of Mormon for all cult babies meets women on women soldiers on the stage. Thank you. One of the final songs is called Skinny Skinny Blonde Woman. I'm so excited about it. But
We
anyway,
must talk about
one
this.
of the things I've literally been thinking and like low key studying Tay-Tay, right? And just like, I've written some sick lines in my book and I have some snappers, but like I need to set them to a sick beat, right? Like I'm gonna get the deification of idiosyncrasy talked about and like, oh, I have another one that I'm so proud of that says, because we were delayed adolescents, now we're going to have our delayed adolescence.
Ooh, okay. I don't
You
know if people
know,
can say
right?
that,
But it's
I'm doing
like,
the little golf
if
clap.
you do different things, anyway, the attention thing and the visibility thing that you said made me think about that. I was like,
Yeah,
like
no.
I really think there's different ways of getting like the message out that makes
Yes,
it echo.
that's correct.
Echo
No,
in
that's
different
correct.
ways.
That like reinforces the signal essentially, right? Like, yeah, absolutely. 1000%.
Ooh. It's like the repeater tower for your ideas.
Yes. Yes, which love that idea.
Oh, sorry. Flew a lot of oh. Missions,
I get it.
army.
Look, that's the headspace you're in, and I get it.
You know, I'm so glad that we had this conversation. I'm so excited for our listeners to hear this. You know, you were saying like you don't know if this would be outside the scope of the conversation, but I'm like, ultimately everything is groups and cults and culture and influence, right?
True.
We talk a lot on this podcast about how studying influence and the science of, you know, motivation and psychology the way you do, you know, is just a tool. Tools can be used as weapons, but they can also be used as tools.
Correct.
So often it's interesting. So often what I see in cults is that it was like white people took something that is a tool in a community of color, like chanting is one of my favorites, chanting in circle, and then use it as like a weapon in their
Right.
groups, and then it's like, that's cult psychology right there. So, this is why we talk about the tactics and all these different topics. I think my theory is I get interesting people in the room and then we'll have good conversations. And like,
Yeah.
my special interest is I can tie everything to cults.
And we have somehow managed to do so. I'm really proud of us.
We have. I'm proud of us too. Well, thank you so much. We're going to want to know what is the best way for people to get a hold of you. We will, of course, have all of Chloe's links in her or in the description. If you are listening to this, please like and subscribe. And if you are not seeing our beautiful faces, you can come watch us on YouTube or on the Patreon. And Chloe, will you tell us your full name as well, please?
Yes, of course. So for those who are unfamiliar, my full name is Madinobi Chloé Nwangwu. So that's my full name.
Chloe.
My first name is something that here's how I help people learn how to pronounce it. So I want you to imagine that you are in a desert and you've been in this desert for days and you are thirsty AF, right? Like you're so thirsty. And you're at this point sort of like crawling through this desert, and then you see off in the distance a sort of shimmering mirage that appears to be an oasis. And so like you like scrabble your way there with the last of your energy. Oh, hurrah, it turns out to in fact be an oasis. You dunk your head into the water, you come out, and the first syllable out of your mouth is, hmm. That's the first syllable of my first name. And so that name is pronounced Ma D No B.
Madinobi.
Beautiful, correct. There you go.
Madinobi.
It's beautiful, and that was the most fantastic description of a name that I have ever heard.
Thank you. I aim
On
to
the other
please.
hand, my name means judged by God.
Oh boy. Well, Madinobi actually means beauty in the heart. So it does have a
Lovely.
meaning. It's lovely. Yeah.
I love it.
Judged by
I love
God, heavens.
Chloe.
Yeah.
I know. When all the little girls are named like Clarity and Light, and your name is judged by God. It's like, oh, well, okay. Thanks. Every time I'm signing my book to a Danielle or a Daniela, I always wonder, like, do they know what their name means? Because they're about to, because it's
They
in there.
Oh
And
my
on that
gosh.
note, everybody, please, I'm sorry, Chloe, did we say where to find you?
Oh, we didn't, but I like genuinely I will include a resources page because there are lots of things that probably questions that came up. But
Perfect.
in general, you can find me doing my nerdy best on LinkedIn. And like I'm kind of sort of on Instagram. Like there's a huge repository of like my brand science stuff that's there. And I'm always in stories sharing about underrecognized leaders in the social impact space doing incredible things and why those things worked. So if that's something that's interesting to you, check me out there. But yeah, otherwise, like that's it. I do have a nerd list if that's something that is cool for you. It's where I talk about influence building and attention management from a scientific perspective. Basically, like, yeah, if you want to have a role in the resistance and you want science backed approaches to that, then like I talk about that there. So join the nerd list and you can see more about that.
Amazing. I haven't even heard of Nerdlist yet, but now I'm excited. All right. Thank you so much, Chloe. This has been a wonderful discussion. And everybody, thank you so much for listening to Cults and the Culting of America. Sorry that Scott had some technical problems, but what a great conversation anyways. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you later.